Welcome to the Imagine Church podcast, where our goal is to bridge the Sunday to Sunday gap. My name is John Harrison, and I am joined once again by our very own lead pastor, Josh Christensen. How are you doing today, Josh?
And I'm doing really, really good. It's good to be able to hear your voice, and at least maybe for some of you also to be able to see you as we record here on the Zoom. So yeah, the sun is shining. So today is off to a great start. I'm for it.
Yeah, it is. It has been at least pretty nice. At least when I took the dogs out this morning, it wasn't too freezing cold, which is that's something that I am very thankful for, because it's the worst going outside and waiting for a puppy to go to the bathroom and be freezing my butt off. But
yeah, I would believe that all of those things are true.
Yep. Well, anyways, we are in the middle of a series about relationships. We really just introed it for the last episode, and this episode is really the first in a series spanning over multiple weeks, where we'll be talking about relationships, specifically in COVID and through different lenses. And so we decided that the best way to kick this off would be to take an episode and talk about our relationship with ourself. And so the first thing I want to ask you is, what is your reaction to the idea that we each have a relationship with ourselves?
Yeah, I think this is such a really important topic, and I think that COVID has only helped bring this forward. But I think if we're real and take a step back, relationships and relationship challenges that we have, whether it's with ourselves, which we'll talk about today, whether it's with family or friends or others, or honestly even God, like those challenges have existed far before the global pandemic has been around. It just has been that over the last almost year now that COVID has been a significant part of all of our lives. It just is a whole lot more clearly seen, I think, and really felt because of some of the patterns and some of the ways that we've been forced at times to be more isolated than we've been before in the past. And so, like I said, to me, this is a really important topic in conversation for us to dive into, because it affects every single one of us. And so when I think about the question of, my response to, do we have a relationship with ourselves? I think the answer is obvious. It's like, yeah, we do have a relationship with ourselves. I think the challenge is that not all of us always recognize that. And maybe more importantly, we don't always think about it in terms of having a relationship with ourselves. We think a lot about having relationships if you're married with your spouse or with your kids. We think a lot about relationships that we have with our families, or relationships that we have with our friends. I'm not sure that we pause and really think about the way that we have relationship with ourselves. And yet I also think it's one of the most critical relationships that we have, because if we're not in a place that is healthy, then it's going to be really hard for us to be in healthy relationships with others. But oftentimes, at least in my life, it feels like I will sacrifice my relationship with myself more often than maybe any other relationship that I have of significance.
Yeah, I think you hit on something really key there. And it's that idea that for many of us, we don't really think about having a relationship with ourselves. I'm sure that there are some people who will be listening or watching this or whatever who will hear that phrase, your relationship with yourself, and kind of be like, what are they talking about? That doesn't really make a lot of sense. And I think that's understandable because, like I said, lots of people don't think about it that way. But the reality is that when you sit and you think about it, we have a relationship with ourselves. It's, how do we treat ourselves? How do we maintain that relationship and help keep that relationship healthy in the same way that we would think about relationships with our friends or with our significant other or with our family? We think about those relationships, and
Yeah.
you have to be intentional about helping those relationships grow and helping to maintain those relationships. But
Yep.
so often we just neglect all of that when it comes to our relationship with ourselves.
Yeah. I think maybe it's important to just help define a little bit of, when we say relationship with self, like what exactly do we mean? What exactly are we talking about? And so maybe if it's okay with you, I'll just maybe help us dive down or go down that road a little bit. It's so I think that God has created every single one of us as unique individuals. It's so I believe that when it comes to relationship with self, it's the way that you see yourself, the way that you treat yourself, the way that you believe in the way that God has created you, or in the gifts, or in the talents, or in the uniqueness that you have. I think so often we try to be so many things to so many other people, and that's a whole other episode or conversation in and of itself. The masks that we wear, or the ways that we try to fit in. But when I think about this idea of having a relationship with self, it really is, how do I see myself, and how do I see the way that God has created me? What are the ways that I choose to grow and develop who I am? Both the strengths that we have and the weaknesses that we have in the midst of this. How am I caring for myself? How am I caring for myself, and not just physically, but also mentally and emotionally and spiritually? And so when we talk about having a relationship with self, at least for me, I think those are some of the ways that we have, that relationship. It's the exact same that we have with anyone else. It's just the way that we think about the way that we are, and the ways that God created us.
Yeah. And I think that serves as a great segue into kind of talking about how do we have a healthy relationship with ourselves? How do we have a good relationship? How do we grow that relationship? And I think one of the things that's really important to point out, and just to mention, is that we are not mental health professionals or anything. We are in no way claiming to be professionals. We are just simply claiming to be two people
Yep.
who have life experiences and thoughts and insights that could potentially help other people in this area of their life as well. Um, and so as we jump in and start talking about, some of that and like ways to help with your relationship with yourself, just want to remind people of that, is that we're not claiming to be professionals or even claiming to know more than they do. Just maybe claiming to know different things or have different ideas. And that's really all it comes down to for us.
Yep.
Um, and so I think for me, one of the things that is really helpful is that sort of like mind shift, that idea of thinking about the relationship that I have with myself through the lens of how do I treat relationships with other people. I think about, especially in the middle of COVID, where so many of us are often separated from whether it's friends or family. Um, you sort of realize, and I think really it's a thing that people tend to realize as they sort of get into adulthood too, is that there are going to be really significant relationships in your life with people who are um, physically far from you. So, like for me, one of my really good friends is he lives in Nashville, and like normally we wouldn't see each other that often, maybe a couple times a year. But the way that friendship has been able to grow, because we're actually closer now than we were when he lived here in Minnesota, is that we spend time talking to each other. We hang out, we play video games together, but we have, real conversations and honest conversations. And, sometimes we need to have those real and those honest conversations with ourselves. We
Yeah.
need to sit and we need to look inward and sort of be introspective and say, what are some of the things that I'm struggling with? What are some of the ways that I mistreat myself?
Mm.
Because I mean, I am certainly guilty of that, where I am someone who is far harsher on myself than I ever would be on another individual.
Yeah.
And when you think about your relationship with yourself through that lens of how would I act if this were a relationship with another person, like some of the things that I say to myself and tell myself, I would never tell someone else. I would never say to someone else. I would encourage them and build them up. And, if they're struggling with something, maybe, point some of those things out to them, but help them and direct them in a path to move forward. Where so often when I'm talking, to myself or in my own head, it's just far more negative than that. And just that
Yeah.
simple shift of thinking about my relationship with myself that way is something that's been helpful for me.
Yeah, I think that's so good. What you just said about the way that we think about ourselves, and the reality is that we understand our failures better than anyone else. Like we know our strengths, but we also just as much know our weaknesses. And I think so many of us are in that same boat, where oftentimes the hardest person that or you're hardest on yourself. There's so little grace that we give ourselves. There's so little like do-overs or second chances. And I think a lot of that stems from, like I said, just the realization that we know our failures better than anyone. And I think one of the things that COVID has brought forward for so many of us is that introspection that honestly probably a lot of us don't take enough time in actually pausing and allowing ourselves to think through what's going on in our lives. Like that's one of the things that COVID has brought to life, is that we all have had more time than we've ever had before away from people, and it has for some people been really good, and I think for a lot of us it's been more challenging. Of hey, now that I'm left with just me, how do I see myself? And how do I see what the way that I view things? And so I think it's so healthy for us to fall into patterns and habits where we remember that we're not perfect. And I think so many times we hold ourselves to the utmost highest standard. And the moment that we fail and the moment that we fall, we just beat ourselves up. It's continuous. And so allowing ourselves grace and knowing that we're not going to make the best decision in every single moment. I know that this isn't about parenting, but those moments where throughout the pandemic, I have two boys. They're 10 and they're 6, and there's been some days where it's just been really hard to be a parent, and it's been really hard to have to deal with them when they're in the house all day, doing distance learning, and you get frustrated and maybe you lose it, and just allowing yourself, grace in the midst of that. That there's going to be moments where we fail. There's going to be moments where things aren't going to go the way that we want them to go. And so how do we choose to treat ourselves in that moment? Like I said, I always fall back to that lens that God created every single one of us. And when he created every single one of us, he created us as good. That doesn't mean that we're going to be good. I know that we all have brokenness that exists in our lives, but that there wasn't a mistake that God made in the way that he created us, that we're a great part of his creation. And I just think like just allowing yourself that grace and that mercy is just really, really huge for us as we think about, self-care. choosing to prioritize, sleep, choosing to prioritize, giving yourself space and time away. My wife is a perfect example of this. I am more extroverted. I want to hang out every Friday with 500 of my closest friends. This would be pre-COVID, not in the midst of this. I want to make sure that that's clear, but I'm an extreme extrovert. My wife is the exact opposite. She's a big introvert. And she has talked multiple times about one of the biggest challenges in the midst of COVID has just been for her the ability to step away and find a way to recharge, because all three of us boys, myself and my two sons, like we're just here. We're in the house 24/7. And so for her, finding that space to be able to get away. And so giving herself permission to go on walks, or giving herself permission to say like, hey, I just need to take an evening or an afternoon or a morning, and I just need a few hours to myself. And so whether that's going and, just going in a room or going on a walk, or, whatever that might be, but prioritizing self-care, and recognizing how we recharge our batteries, I think is really big when it comes to this idea of relationship with self.
Yeah, I think right at the end there, you hit on something that's really important, and it's that idea of having an understanding of who we are as individuals. Because you're right. For a lot of us, COVID has made our lives less busy, and as a result, for some of us, there are significantly less distractions in our life, and that opens up the window to realize, what are some of the things that you are struggling with, that you are just filling your life with task after task after thing, so that whether you knew it or not, you were just filling your schedule so that you didn't have the time to deal with the issues that you had, or feel the problems that you had, and really just having an understanding of who you are as an individual helps with that, because it helps you understand, okay, how am I going to respond in this situation? What am I feeling? Why am I feeling it? How in who I am as an individual can I move forward and be better? And so, I mean, there are so many tools to help people understand their self more. I mean, for me, when I was in school, one of the one of the things that was a constant theme throughout all of my ministry courses was that we were constantly taking like personality assessments, or inventories or self assessments, like team dynamics assessments, all of it. And the idea behind it is that in order for us to be able to best help other people, we have to know ourselves really, really well. And so that is something that for me has been a huge blessing, where I have gotten to know who I am really, really well. And people might hate them or roll their eyes at them or whatever, but things like the Myers Briggs, or really popular right now is like the Enneagram. Um, all of those things, like you can take tests to figure out like your emotional intelligence, to know how well you understand emotions, like all of those things can be really helpful tools. I think it's important for people to understand that they're not tools to tell you who you are. It's tools to help you better understand who you are, and how you work. And so those are some really, really practical areas to turn to be able to better understand, okay, how can I have a healthy relationship with myself?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and you know, obviously, like I just talked about going to school for ministry, and both of us are, working at church, or pastors. And so, the question that I want to ask now, and really want to dive into a little bit in our last, 5-10 minutes here as we wrap up, is how does God play into this idea of our relationship with ourself? What role does he play in that?
Yeah.
Um,
I, I think that's such a really good question. And, I go back to what I said a few minutes ago. I think God created every single one of us. And I think sometimes because of the fact that we see ourselves better than anyone else and that we know our faults and our failures and we know all of the ways that we come up short, that sometimes or oftentimes that's the lens that we choose to see ourselves with, all the shortcomings that we have. This is something that I've said before, but I just really believe that it's true that as we grow older, we learn what we're supposed to do in life based off of the failures that we've had more than the successes that we've had. If you ask a 4 or a 5-year-old what he wants to be when they grow up, I mean, you'll get infinite number of answers. And oftentimes those answers are just completely unrealistic. And as we get older in life, it feels like we pigeonhole ourselves more and more and more when we're told that we're not good enough here or we're not good enough there. And I just think that God sees us the opposite way, that he doesn't see us through the lens of all the failures that we've had, but that he sees us through the lens of that when he created us as good. And so when I think about relationship with self, and when I think about how do I have a healthy relationship with myself, I think it's being reminded of the way that God created me. um and it's through the lens of the way that God sees me. Like my identity and my self-worth isn't tied to the success or failures that I have at work. It's not tied into the gifts and the talents that I have or that I don't have. I really believe that it's tied into a God who loves me unconditionally, to a God who accepts me unconditionally, to a God who gives us grace regardless of how we've acted before. And so, um, you know, God loves every single one of us so much. And so, recognizing and realizing that our self worth derives and comes from there. And so, when we think about self worth in self care, you know, knowing that it's okay to give yourself grace, and it's okay to give yourself mercy, and that you were created as good, and to rest in that. Like we're going to get through this, and that we'll be able to come out on the other side stronger, and that God is with us every single step of the way. I know that we talk about this at church all the time, but Imagine Church, the name of the church that I lead, that both of us work at, it comes from Ephesians chapter 3, where it says, "Now to he who is able to do immeasurably more, greater than what you or I could hope for or imagine." And I think that sentence is saying that he does immeasurably more, that it's greater than what we could hope for or imagine. And so, um, yeah, that's the way that he sees us, not through the lens of all the failures that we've had. And I think sometimes we need to rest more in that.
yeah. I think about, two, um, two like really simple truths. And the first comes, all the way from the beginning, where God spent, he spent time creating the earth. And after every day of creation, he looked at the earth and he said, "It is good." And
Yeah.
then at the very end, God looked at the earth. He looked at all of his creation, knew that it was good, but knew that it was missing something, and that something that it was missing was man. And he
Yeah.
created man in that moment. Um, and he looked at it and said that it was good. And lots of things have changed since that point. Sin has entered into the world. We stumble and we fall, but still, um, God creates us, and he creates us as good, and he looks at us as good. And I think that for lots of us, it's time that we started to look at ourselves that same way,
Yeah.
and understand that, that at the end of the day, like we are
Yeah.
good and we are not a failure. We're not defined by our failures. I think about, as like you have shared, with me personally and as a part of, whether it's your sermons or whatever at church, talking with your mentor, and he looked
Yeah.
at you and said, God has already forgiven you. When are you going to forgive yourself? A
Mm.
very,
Yeah.
very simple but very profound question, and I think that it's the question that all of us need to ask ourselves.
Yeah.
Um, is that God has already forgiven us for all the mistakes, all the failures, all the places we've tripped up and fallen short. He's forgiven us for
Yeah.
all of those things. And when are we going to forgive ourselves so that we're able to move on, and move into a better life and a healthier relationship with ourselves?
Yeah. I think it's so key to stay connected to the source of life. Like if we want to have healthy relationships, it starts with self-care. But to me, that also starts with making sure that we're connected to the creator, that we're created or that we're connected to that source of life, and being reminded of his love, and being reminded of the fact that he created us, and that he loves, and that he forgives and gives us that grace and mercy. I think that when we're not connected, it's really easy to start buying into all the failures that we have, instead of when we're not reminding ourselves of how God sees us and the way that he perceives each and every one of us.
Yeah. Well, as we wrap up here, just wanna want to say thanks, for being a part of this episode and for taking part in this conversation with me. Thank you to all the people who have joined us and are listening on Spotify or iTunes or whatever platform you're listening on, or if you're watching on YouTube as well. And I also want to just mention that we've mentioned a couple different things as a part of this, one of which being that we're not professionals. We are not mental health professionals. But in the description, like the show notes, we will have links to some actual mental health professionals. If throughout the course of this you've realized that that is something that you need, we'll also put links in there to some of those personality inventories and different things to be able to get better acquainted with yourself. But yeah, I just want to say a huge thank you for joining us for this episode of the Imagine Church podcast. We hope that you will continue on this journey with us as we go through and talk about relationships, specifically as it relates to relationships within COVID, because they are so different than what we've been used to. So we just thank you for being a part of this experience with us. And we hope that it has been helpful and beneficial to you. And our prayer is that God continues to do immeasurably more.